I'm going to talk to you about mega living seascapes and really the contributions and challenges and changes that have happened in the management of marine protected areas. And this is really work that has happened together with a lot of my colleagues in SANParks. There's a number of scientists and managers that are part of this journey, and I want to acknowledge them. I did email the talk yesterday evening, but most of them wouldn't have seen this, so they don't know what's coming. I just want to start off with a little bit of context on SANParks, really, and that is that we're a Schedule 3A public entity, and we manage 21 national parks, 10 marine protected areas, 3 World Heritage Sites, 5 Transfrontier Conservation Areas, 3 Ramsar sites, 3 protected environments, and 5 major estuaries across the country. And that really makes about 4 million hectares on the land and about 370,000 hectares at sea. And in the context of protected areas in South Africa, it makes up about 70% of the state-owned terrestrial protected areas and about 40% of the state-managed coastal marine protected areas. So that's just for context. And in terms of marine protected areas, just a bit of context on the South African MPAs. So there's 43 declared marine protected areas in South African waters, and they make up 5.4% of our territorial waters. So these are marine protected areas which give some conservation outcomes. And there was a huge increase in the marine protected area estate in 2019 as an outcome of Operation Phakisa, where we saw the increase in protected marine areas move from 0.4 to 5% of the economic exclusive zone of South African waters. And 10 of the MPAs are actually assigned to SANParks as management agency, and you'll see there in the yellow dots on the map, those are the MPAs that were existing before 2019, before the Phakisa MPA declarations, and there's 5 that make up the West Coast. There we go. There's Table Mountain, Tsitsikamma, and what used to be the Bird Island MPA. In 2019, with Operation Phakisa, we had additional areas handed over to us, Namakwa, Robben Island, and the extended Addo MPA. And really, this is from some work by Kirkman and colleagues published in 2023, looking at the expansion of the protected area, or the marine protected area estate, over time. And I've looked at the outcomes of that in 2 contexts. The first is in the context of conservation, and there's 4 main eras. In the first era, from the 1960s to 94, you can see that there was a steady but small increase in marine protected area declarations, but there was no participation in how these areas were selected. It had very exclusionary and preservationist approaches. There was great dispossession of access by local communities, and there really was a strong shallow water focus. The next era, which is from 94 to 2010, you see there's a slight increase in areas added to the estate, and this time was really a time of systematic assessment of how representative our marine protected areas are. There was the first evaluation of the management of MPAs, and there was a shift to a deeper water focus in terms of protection. The third era, which is 2010 to 19, includes the Phakisa era, where you see this huge increase in the MPA estate. And there was a much stronger alignment of terrestrial with marine protected areas and a systematic planning that actually helped prioritize which areas needed to be looked at. And there was a declaration of the offshore marine protected areas. And then post-2019, we haven't had any actually extension to the estate, but we've actually had the first national coastal and marine systematic biodiversity plan that's been developed with critical biodiversity areas that have been defined for the marine realm, which is a first. So what does this mean for SANParks? And I really pay homage here to Anae Oosthuizen, who was a marine planner in SANParks for many a year and helped with a lot of the Operation Phakisa expansion to the marine protected area estate. And what's happened is that over time, SANParks, and these are the Phakisa 2019 declarations, Over time, the protected area estate has massively increased under SANParks' management, so much so that now we are managing about 370,000 hectares at sea, which is more than double the estate that we were managing before 2019. And compared to the area that we're managing on land, it's just under 10%, so still relatively small in terms of the overall conservation responsibilities of SANParks. But if we look again at this timeline of the expansion of the estate, and we don't look at it from a conservation outcome, but from a governance perspective, we see that there's been quite important changes in how we've thought about MPAs. So firstly, in the first era, there were really ad hoc declarations, very inconsistent policies. The objectives of the MPAs were poorly defined, they weren't well communicated, there was no zonation for multiple uses, there was definitely no management plans, and there was really poorly coordinated institutions nationally that managed or were involved with the governance of MPAs. In the next phase, so 94 to 2010, there was this re-evaluation after democracy of MPAs, and the policy language became much more people-centric. There was new fisheries legislation that was brought in with the Marine Living Resources Act, and there was the first body established that coordinated, from a governance perspective, marine conservation, and it fell under one government agency. But we still didn't have this inclusivity and engagement taking place around MPA declaration and management. In the follow-up era, there was policies that were mainstreaming small-scale fisheries. There was a big shift here in terms of the coordination body around marine areas into two. One wing, the conservation wing, fell under the Department of Environment Affairs. The other, the fisheries, the more commercial component, fell under another government department, the Agriculture Department. And at this point, management plans were required for MPAs. In the last era, we've had again a reunification of the conservation and the fisheries components of governance under one department, but there's still big tensions. And we've had the first early co-management steps around marine protected areas. But I want to use Tsitsikamma MPA, which is Africa's oldest marine protected area, to really reflect a little bit on the changes in thinking, the changes in governance, management, and the benefit sharing, or the benefits that have flowed out of MPAs, to chart that over time. So bear with me a little bit. So in 1964, this MPA was declared. At that stage, they still allowed some shore-based angling through permits for visitors and local communities. In the 1970s, angling became restricted, first to 15 sites, then to a particular area near Storms River. And then in the late 1970s, there was the first petition from the Tsitsikamma Angling Union saying, but we want access. Our communities have traditionally always utilized resources in this area. We need it for spiritual and family and other needs. In 1994, there was a petition again to say, we want to be able to access these areas, not only in the small designated spaces. In 1998, under the Marine Living Resources Act, actually all angling was stopped in all marine protected areas legislatively. So there was a complete disconnect between people and the marine areas. In 2005, there was a protest march by the Tsitsikamma Angling Forum to try and petition for access to this marine area. Then in 2006, there was an initial engagement with communities to start talking about reopening access, and a task team was established. But very quickly thereafter, in 2007, the minister took the decision to rule out any opening of the MPA for community access because there was huge opposition and petitioning happening. In 2011, Tsitsikamma MPA was incorporated into the Garden Route National Park when it was declared. And then in 2014, there was a ministerial visit to the area, and he decided to revive the steering committee with the communities to look at access, providing access. In 2015, so the very next year, there was a gazetting of the intent to rezone Tsitsikamma MPA with draft regulations. And at the end of that year, in December, there was an agreement between SANParks and those communities to allow for communal fishing in proposed controlled zones on an experimental basis. Very quickly, by January 2016, there was a major legal challenge to this, and the High Court ruled against any pilot project with the communities being implemented in Tsitsikamma. But it took a year, and the regulations were published at the end of 2016 for the Tsitsikamma to gazette 3 coastal control areas or zones where communities can access the coastline to fish and to actually recreate and to fulfill spiritual purposes. So it's been a long and tedious journey. And really what I want to say is that we've moved from a Tsitsikamma contested to a Tsitsikamma restored, where there's conservation outcomes, but there's also restoration of dignity and belonging by those communities that have always been connected to those seascapes. There's also been a recognition of customary rights and coexistence by people and nature. And I love this. This rezonation has actually resulted in a renewed peace in the area. And that's a quote from something that Victor once wrote. But we also have very different MPAs. So Tsitsikamma MPA is one, the oldest one. We have Addo Elephant National Park MPA, which under Pakisa expanded massively from the old Bird Island MPA. It now also includes the Sundays River Estuary. And it was gazetted, and these objectives are set nationally to protect and rebuild overexploited resources, to conserve important bird tops species, so threatened species, and to create this contiguous protected area that includes the marine system, the estuarine system, and the terrestrial systems. So really, really nice. It has these controlled zones and restricted zones, which allow different types of use. In the controlled zones, all types of fishing are allowed, including commercial fishing. But really importantly, it's also right next to Kucha and the industrial development zone of PE, which leads to a lot of challenges. On the one hand, this MPA overnight became 16 times bigger than it was before, which became a real challenge for SANParks. There's access, there's remote islands, there's no coastal base to operate from, and there's all these port activities with increased shipping, industrial plants, pollution, oil spills, mariculture, and more recently, seismic exploration, and of course the offshore bunkering that's happening off Kucha. One of the big things in this MPA also is that it's a place for penguins. And penguins, African penguins, over time have actually declined by more than 90% during the 20th century. They're endemic to South Africa and Namibia, and you can see just they were listed as endangered in 2010, but even since then, there's been a 42% decline in these populations. And if you look at this graph, which is just from 2000 to 2019, you can see this line here is the decline in the penguin population, and these bars are the decline in sardines and anchovies, which are their key food source. So you can see a complete mirroring. But in other MPAs, actually, penguins are a major socioeconomic driver. So in Boulders, in Table Mountain MPA, there's about 1 million tourists that visit and see the penguins. And they generate about 311 million rands of income or revenue annually, creating about 885 jobs. So this is not just a conservation issue. So should African penguins go extinct in the wild, and they are projected to do so at the current trajectories, they will have actually major ecological, social, and economic repercussions. And the question really is the African penguin maybe the canary of the oceans? It's telling us that something is changing and something is going wrong. Is this one of the first warning signs for what's going wrong? And this is actually Kucha Harbour. The little boat is SANParks going out to manage the MPA. So that's just a bit of scale for you. And really, when we think about these MPAs as these complex social ecological systems, there's all these feedbacks between the social, the economic, and the ecological. And there's lots of trade-offs that have to happen all the time. Protection versus use, and in MPAs, that's partly through zonation. But really differently from the land-based conservation, there's commercial versus small-scale use that needs to be traded off and considered. There's local and international scales. So the marine area is actually under huge pressure from international utilization and international pollution. So it's not even just something that we can think about locally. And of course, we need to think about how do we fund conservation at sea? Is it a public good? Should it self-fund? How would it self-fund? And of course, the whole time we have to act while we're learning. And even more so than on the land, we need to think about shared responsibilities, cooperative governance, and trade-offs, particularly across the multiple sectors that work in the marine or with the marine space. So in terms of the Kunming framework, the 30 by 30 goals, 30% of the ocean needs to be protected by 2030. And if we do that, the thinking is we'll have sustainable fisheries, climate resilience, tourism, jobs, education, cultural heritage will be protected, all these wonderful things will happen. But how do we get there? So we need to acknowledge that at a local scale or a national scale, there's huge pressures on our systems. Illegal harvesting, and with that comes organized crime. We should not only be talking about rhinos and rhino poaching. What about abalone poaching and the same organized crime networks that are involved with those things? There's unsustainable fisheries, many of them commercial, that are impacting on our systems. And of course, climate change and all those things too. But we also need to be, and this talks a little bit to what Sharon was saying, articulate some of the good things. So what is the contribution of MPAs to fisheries, to biodiversity conservation, to people, to livelihoods? We need to think a little bit about some of these endangered species, maybe as the canaries that are warning us that things are really changing in these systems that we don't understand well enough yet. And we need to acknowledge that estuaries are intimately connected to our MPAs, and they're these important fish nurseries and breeding areas which actually lead to food security and sustainability in the long run too. And we need to understand that diversity of ecosystem services provided by our MPAs. But in South Africa, we have this quite negative legacy around MPAs, this exclusionary legacy, and we need to overcome that. There's a lot of contestations, fisheries versus conservation, exploration and security of power versus conservation versus penguins. How do we balance these things? And how, in South Africa, do we fund this national mandate of marine conservation? At a much lower scale, at a park scale or an MPA scale, how do we fund operations, monitoring, compliance? How do we manage offshore when we can't easily access these areas? And how do we really assess how effective our management has been? And we heard a little bit about Vision 2040 earlier that was revealed last week. And really, it aims for every South African to have a stake in conservation and have livelihoods and benefits flowing out of conservation. And as we also heard, the Vision 2040 is all about mega living landscapes. But my question is, what about mega living seascapes? Have we forgotten about that component? So if these mega living landscapes are these interconnected, massive interconnected areas, where protected areas, are not these islands, but they're connected within the wider communities, and they foster coexistence and inclusivity and sustainable development, well then, I'm putting out there that MPAs, or marine protected areas, already are these mega living seascapes. They're already boundaryless. There's no boundaries in our MPAs or the sea. They are massive, they are interconnected. They connect the sea via the coastlines to the land. But they do require some redress. So we need to think about balancing commercial versus small scale and local livelihoods. Because currently those small scale local guys have been excluded. And we cannot necessarily just give more we're going to have to maybe take away a little bit from some to give to others to redress. And we really need to be thinking about how we do local scale effort and combine that with international collaboration, because the seas are actually mega living global scapes. They're not even national scapes, so that we can strive for sustainability. Thanks very much.